All right, I think I am live, but I am not sure if anyone can hear me. Nobody, there's nobody here to tell me. Check, audio check. Well, if there is anybody in the chat, I would love to hear from you guys once you do come around to let me know that my audio is actually working. I'm not confident that it is. Is my audio working? Anybody in the chat? Let me know. Can you hear me? All right, that's great. Audio's good. Fantastic. Thank you, guys. Last time I tried this, my audio didn't work initially, and I assumed that it would happen again this time. But I guess we're in better shape. I am really happy to see you guys pop in. Thank you so much for joining me. I meant to do this actually on Friday when we released our most recent air power video, but I was working on that iron beam video that we put out on Saturday instead. Hopefully that's good to go with you guys. But I wanted to take a minute to answer questions that you guys might have about any of the videos we put up recently or what's going on in the world right now. And I also wanted to take a minute to tell you guys about a new series we've got starting tomorrow called ManPower that I am really excited about, because this will be our first series that I'm not at the helm for. Instead, we're actually bringing in former Army Ranger Luke Ryan, who's a good friend of mine from a long time ago, and he'll be focusing on stories about service members themselves rather than about the technology that they use. The first episode of ManPower will actually be about Luke's own journey joining the U.S. Army and becoming an Army Ranger, as well as his time deploying. And the second episode, which we've already got in the bank, is about the same sort of process, but becoming a Marine Corps scout sniper and going on to deploy alongside special forces teams with the U.S. Army. I'm particularly stoked about it, to be honest with you, because Luke is just such a great guy. And I have been trying to find a way to work with him since I stood up Sandboxx News 3 years ago now. Luke, if you're not familiar with him, after his time in the U.S. Army as a Ranger, he and I worked together for a while at an outlet called SOFREP before Luke went on to run social media for Black Rifle Coffee for some time. He did a lot of their video content. Luke is an excellent videographer. He's also won some awards for doing like local news segments and stuff in the past, aside from being a published poet, which I know isn't always what you think of when you think of special operations veterans, but he's an incredible poet and a fiction writer. He's got an awesome series called The First Marauder about a post-apocalyptic sort of zombie apocalypse situation that he really leverages actual combat tactics in, which makes the book really interesting reading. Luke is just sort of like an all-around great guy who's good at everything. So I'm really excited to have him on our team making some video content for us. I'm just curious, Alex, are you interested in an autistic take on military power? You know, I think that's probably what you guys get from me. I mean, I'm not autistic technically by diagnosis, but TikTok tells me I am all the time. I certainly have pretty serious ADHD, which I think is a bit of a superpower in this line of work. Hi, Daniel. I appreciate the shout out here. Luke wears a Ranger tab. That says it all. I agree. I actually, a little known fact about me, I competed in mixed martial arts and pancration throughout my time in the Marine Corps. I was also a black belt in the Marine Corps martial arts program. And I did a lot of rolling with Army Rangers and Green Berets, a couple SEALs here and there, but less so than the Army's special operations units. And I'll say this might be a bit controversial, but I tend to like Rangers the best. They always have the best attitude and they're always really hard workers. And to be honest, I came closest to being balled up by Rangers, which might just say that they focus more on ground fighting. I couldn't tell you, but the toughest, training bouts I had were against Army Rangers. Thank you for watching my videos. Rockland, I really appreciate the love. Tuning in from my desk at your aerospace defense job, Matthew, that is rad. That's honestly why I do this. Is the audio coming in and out for everybody? Apologies if it is. Let me know. But genuinely, the reason why I do this, the reason why it's so much fun to do this is because how well informed and passionate you guys are. When I try to talk to my wife about aviation, she just kind of like rolls her eyes and is like, oh, here he goes again. But you guys get it. In fact, a lot of times you know as much or more than I do about specific things, and that's really cool. A poet is getting time to show it. Yeah. Luke's got 2 poetry books that are out. I'll make sure to include links to them in the description of his first video, as well as his fiction writing. He's also written for the New York Times and a number of other outlets in a news fashion, but just in general, he does like to do a lot of fiction. Mr. Kojak, thank you so much for that $5. I really appreciate it. Let's see. Jonathan Tully, I have some big questions about high-tech drone usage in Ukraine. Drones that do suppression of enemy air defenses, air-to-air, air-to-ground, and AWACS. Plausible deniability by the operator. Why don't we have them? Well, the truth is, it's just a question of how advanced that technology is and how widely distributed that technology has become. Do we have the tech for that? Absolutely. But does that tech exist in sufficient numbers that we could pass it off to another nation to allow them to use it? Are our own policies and procedures for leveraging that sort of stuff mature enough that we can very quickly train a nation like Ukraine on its operation? The answer to those questions are no. While that technology does exist, and there are certainly applications for it in the US defense apparatus, it isn't really mature enough for us to be able to easily train others, nor do those systems exist in sufficient numbers for us to have a bunch of spares laying around. You know, like as you saw with those ATACMs we recently provided to Ukraine, those were built in the 1990s. That's sort of the time frame a lot of the equipment Ukraine is getting tends to come from. And drones that are capable of SEAD and things like that just didn't exist in that time frame. Let's see. I apologize if I say your name wrong. Severio. Hi, Alex. Do you know what aerial assets is Israel using in its campaign on Gaza? Is it mainly F-15, F-16, F-35, and why? So Israel's got a pretty advanced air asset apparatus. And what I mean by that is they've got a wide variety of air platforms, including remotely operated or semi-automated drones, all the way up to pretty capable fifth-generation fighters like the F-35I, which has a couple of slight differences from the F-35s you might be accustomed to from the United States or many other allies. The F-35 is likely playing a role, but more of a ISR role than delivering munitions. In a situation like airstrikes against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, when there are no air defense assets to really be concerned with above a certain altitude, or really at all for that matter. And as a result, they're flying in pretty permissive airspace, which means they can basically leverage anything with wings and a hard point to do what they're doing. Let's see. Thanks for all the awesome work. Thank you. My videos are your poetry. That makes my whole day. I really appreciate that. Do you think we could run into a situation in a world war where pumping out tons of cheaper jets will make more sense than F-35s, aka avoiding the Tiger tank situation of World War II? Oh boy, do I. I actually put out a video a few weeks ago about this. The Air Force's concept of air power and mass, or affordable mass. And the whole idea here is that the United States in particular, but really defense technology as a whole, has really moved towards a fewer number of more broadly capable platforms rather than a huge number of very specific platforms like we saw in World War II. A great example of that are the fighter apparatus, right? So America's got F-15s, F-16s, F-A-18s, F-22s, and F-35s. That sounds like a lot of airframes, but back in the day, America also maintained a ton of very specialized attack aircraft that would fly alongside those fighters, with those fighters sort of protecting them in a defensive role against intercept fighters, and those attack aircraft focusing on air-to-ground operations. That's just not how we do it anymore. Today, fighters pretty much do all of the attack jobs, with a few exceptions, and they also have absorbed a lot of other ones, like intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And in the form of the EA-18G Growler, the FA-18 Super Hornet really also became an electronic attack aircraft. Hi, Emmanuel. I appreciate the shout out. A breath of fresh air, military news from an informed and knowledgeable source. Thank you. That means the world to me. Let's talk about plasma confinement vessels. Now that, maybe I might need more context on that question. My brain immediately summons a couple different things. The first one being Lockheed Martin's fusion patents, which are effectively plasma confinement vessels that could theoretically be used for containerized fusion, that according to Lockheed's patents, could be housed in things as small as a shipping container, and in the not too distant future, something as small as the fuselage of an F-16 is what they showed in their patent diagrams. But again, having a patent doesn't necessarily mean a technology actually exists in a workable form today. Alex, if you were to build air defenses for a small, mid-sized country from scrap, where would you start? And in the end, what would it look like when completed? Love from Croatia. I really appreciate that question. That is a huge question. I suppose the biggest concern I would have would be budget, because the truth is, whether you're buying systems from another country or you're developing your own, there aren't a lot of engineering hurdles that can't be overcome with sufficient budget. Genius, I've said this a lot of times, is not limited by borders. You will find incredible engineers regardless of the nation that you're operating in. And what usually tends to separate the capability of systems isn't the prowess of the engineers in that nation, but rather the resources allocated to them, which could be because the nation's economy may be struggling, or it could be just that there isn't the political will to fund that sort of effort. Israel is a great example of a fairly small nation with a very robust air defense apparatus because they are willing to invest very heavily in it. Whereas you can find other nations of similar geographical size that, don't have nearly as adept air defenses because they don't need them. They're not under pretty constant threat of air attack. So if money is no object, it would probably look a lot like Israel's, Arrow top layer, followed by David Sling medium layer, followed by the Iron Dome lower layer, but not necessarily those systems. You might have Patriot instead of Arrow, or something along those lines, but a layered air defense apparatus where you have something that specializes in long range strikes like Patriot, followed by something that specializes in more intermediate range, and then something that specializes in close range from things like quadcopters and mortars would be essential. There is no single air defense system that's going to sort of solve all of those different problems for you. Is it right to think that advanced fourth gens like F-16 Block 70 or F-15EX are basically fifth gens minus stealth? Love from the Philippines. I love the Philippines. That's a great question. To some extent, yeah. So it's important to understand that generational designations sort of aren't real. I mean, they're real, but they're not real. And by that, I mean, they sort of started out as industry shorthand that just made it easier to specify the capabilities that you were trying to put into a new design. But as that industry shorthand sort of took off, particularly in the 1990s, as the F-22 Raptor was sort of coming into its own, it became a marketing term more than an industry shorthand term. There are no official definitions for any generational designation. The Air Force, for instance, does have, a rubric for what's fourth gen and what's fifth gen, but the Navy is under no requirement to use the same definition, and other nations certainly are under no requirement. And a good example of that is that what we consider to be fifth generation fighters, or fighters that are designed from the ground up to have stealth and a high degree of sensor fusion, they need to be multi-role and supersonic. China considers that same generation to be the fourth gen, just because they use a different scale. So to that end, are highly advanced fourth generation fighters with modern avionics effectively fifth gen, from the skin inside? Yeah, more or less. The F-15EX actually has more onboard computing power than the F-35 started out with. But it's important to remember that one of the things just about everyone can agree with is that it's not just sensor fusion, but stealth that makes a fifth gen fighter fifth gen. And to that point, it's important to note that there is no requirement for how stealthy you need to be in order to qualify for fifth gen. It's really about design intent rather than outcome. And that's why you'll hear people say Russia's Su-57 is fifth gen. It is significantly stealthier than its own predecessor, the Su-27, even if it's not really stealth compared to American stealth fighters. Alex, can you comment on the Israeli steel ring mortar? I'll be honest with you, I don't know a ton about it. I've read a little bit about it. It's definitely interesting. And I think it's worth note, especially because we're talking about a high precision munition, which sort of runs counter to some of the stories we're hearing out of this offensive in Gaza. It doesn't sound like precision has been a real focus, but that's hard to say. It does look as though a lot of Israeli forces are focused on using precision strikes, trying to minimize, sort of civilian casualties. But, it's a very messy and chaotic situation. It doesn't look like everybody's worried about minimizing civilian casualties. I'm reluctant to say that it points toward anything. Although, laser guided or high precision, mortars and artillery munitions are certainly nothing new. I'm not surprised to see them on this battlefield. I think they have United States laser weapons there now as well. They may well, though it's important to note, I've just like my video that I put up on Saturday about laser weapons, sort of outlines. Laser weapons are still fairly immature in terms of their capabilities as an air defense asset. 100 kilowatt weapon like the Iron Beam. Similarly, the 50 to 150 kilowatt weapons that the United States currently has in service can certainly take down a mortar or a rocket, but they would struggle against anything really bigger. It's not as cool as it is and as interesting as this technology is. It's not going to have a massive effect on the battlefield, even if Iron Beam or American provided laser weapons are there. I haven't heard about American lasers being there, but it's entirely feasible. I love your work. How would you do to protect the airspace for a place the size of Canada? I'm a very concerned Canadian. Well, lucky for you and lucky for us here in the United States, protecting the airspace over both America and Canada is sort of a joint effort. And that really works to the benefit of both the United States and Canada. And we saw that play out in real time this past February when F-22 Raptors shot down balloons or flying saucers or whatever they may have been over Alaska and Canada. That happened because NORAD is a joint American-Canadian effort. And that benefits the United States because Canada's got a huge amount of territory north of the US. And the truth of the matter is, an offensive coming from Russia or China would very likely traverse Canadian airspace, or at least come pretty close to it. So thanks to our cooperation with Canada, we're able to put a lot of assets in that area to keep tabs on things. And in exchange, Canada has access to our air defense assets. A good example being Canada operates a lot of CF-18 Hornets, whereas the F-22 Raptor, the F-35, what Canada doesn't have quite yet, are far more capable and advanced platforms. So it really is a very cooperative agreement that works out for both of us. I'd be shocked if they didn't have a USAP modern project Thor under a different name, likely to do with the X-37B and I guess SpaceX. Now, Thor, I'd imagine you're talking about a SAP, like a special access program or project, and Thor being like a kinetic hypersonic weapon from orbit, maybe from the X-37B. And the truth is, that's possible, something like tungsten rods, but to be honest with you, it's not necessarily all that practical. Deploying like a tungsten rod kinetic munition from orbit isn't the most practical way to engage targets from those sorts of altitudes. I'm not saying it's impossible. I would never say never. And likewise, it's worth noting that in the new Tom Clancy book that we did some content about, it was actually tungsten rods that were deployed from hypersonic aircraft as their primary form of munition. It's entirely feasible that sort of concept has continued to mature, sort of behind closed doors, but I do find it relatively unlikely just because of the immense mass it would take to get those platforms into orbit, to arm those systems, and then to keep them more or less secret. I'm not really sure that the United States would be capable of that. Once laser weapons become effective at destroying incoming missiles, they will add energy-absorbing abilities to missiles. Yeah, absolutely. One quick way that you could do that right now is to just program your missiles to rotate as they travel along. The way that lasers right now intercept missiles isn't often by burning through the nose cone. The nose cone of missiles are the strongest and most heat-resistant portion of the missile because it has to withstand a great deal of friction and pressure as it flies through the air at high speeds. And as a result, if it's not near the maximum temperature or pressure limits, then the laser is not going to do much to the nose cone. So instead, you try to engage missiles from the side. And that's what programs like the Navy's new Hellcap laser aim to do. Hellcap is like a really butchered acronym for High Energy Laser Anti-Cruise Missile Platform. But ultimately, the idea is to burn through the side of cruise missiles and not the nose. But the way that you would compensate for that would be to have the missile sort of spin on that axis so that the laser isn't impacting the exact same point on the missile's fuselage as it's flying through the air. And then it would take a great deal more time to burn through and would reduce the efficacy of the laser. You did a great episode on the Dark Star hypersonic projects a while back, including a sighting over the UK. Any updates on that subject? Yeah, Hermeus actually just released the first pictures of their quarter horse Mark 0 technology demonstrator or prototype. Now, quarter horse Mark 0 right now looks kind of like the bones of an F-16 almost, though it is about 9 feet shorter than an F-16. But it really is the skeleton of what could become the first reusable hypersonic aircraft. They're intending to start taxi tests with it here in the next couple of months. They're going to use what they learn from those taxi tests to inform any design changes they might make for the quarter horse Mark 1, which will be a subsonic technology demonstrator, and they'll use what they learned from that for the Mark II, which will be supersonic but below Mach 3. And then the quarter horse Mark IV is the first jet that they intend to actually transition while airborne from turbojet to ramjet power. And that quarter horse Mark IV will probably exceed the SR-71's, sort of stated record top speed of Mach 3.2 pretty early in its testing regime, and they're aiming for Mach 4 with quarter horse right now. Dark Horse is the platform that will come immediately after that. The Air Force has already given them $100 million for engine maturation. Dark Horse will be powered by a similar combined cycle engine, but with a much larger turbofan rather than turbojet as sort of that jet engine basis. It'll be using an F-100, the same engine that powers the F-15, which will allow it to carry much larger payloads. When I spoke to Skylar Shuford over at Hermeus about it, he said that the Dark Horse platform may potentially even carry 2 of these Chimera-based combined cycle turbofan ramjet engines, which wouldn't make it significantly faster, but would really increase its acceleration and payload. So this aircraft is probably never going to beat Mach 6. That's just sort of the limit for ramjet technology, but it is the same basic technological premise as the Air Force Research Labs Mayhem or Lockheed Martin's SR-72 using a scramjet instead, which could potentially even beat Mach 10, but that's a much taller order. Hermeus will probably be flying at Mach 5 or 6 for a year or two before anything publicly disclosed is flying at Mach 10, and Hermeus will be doing it for a lot cheaper just because of the way that they're going about it. Alex, what other YouTube channels offer legit and current military technology info? That's an awesome and great question that I am not the right guy to answer. I apologize. There are a couple of channels on YouTube that I check out from time to time, but for the most part, I try to avoid them because I'm really worried about accidentally copying somebody or, an idea seeping into my brain and me forgetting where it comes from and not providing, the appropriate citation. I'm worried that it'll just seep into my brain and I'll end up not crediting someone for a great bit of nuanced context that they gave me. And because of that, my anxiety kind of keeps me away from watching them at all. I do know a lot of people tell me Millennium 7's a great channel. I'm sure it is. I'm blanking on the other one. Perun, I might be mispronouncing that. I've heard that he's got really good content. But to be honest with you, I don't watch a lot of defense technology YouTube creators just out of that anxiety that I'll end up unintentionally, stealing something from them or being too close to what they're doing. And I want to try to stay in my own lane, I guess. But that said, if you guys know any good channels that I should check out, let me know, and I definitely will. How can a hypersonic bomber be considered, considering Neil Armstrong was flying at Mach 6 in the X-15 before he went to the moon? So it's important to note that the X-15, which hit Mach 6.7 back in the 60s with William Knight on board, wasn't a jet. It was a rocket plane. And that is a very important distinction. The X-15 was powered by the XLR-99 liquid-fueled rocket engine, and it wasn't particularly reusable. The XLR-99 needed to be completely rebuilt after every 1 hour of flight. Oh, Habitual Line Crosser, a great channel. He's a good friend of mine. You should definitely watch him. The XLR-99 had to be rebuilt after every 1 hour of flight, but that was actually good for a fair number of flights because it burned through so much fuel so quickly, about 10,000 pounds of fuel per minute, that the aircraft could never carry enough fuel on board for it to burn more than like 83 seconds initially, and then like 120 seconds after they added external fuel tanks. So even though it did hit Mach 6.7, it never flew further than about 240 miles, and it needed an engine rebuild after every hour. So it's not exactly something we can make operational in any real way. Whereas an air-breathing scramjet or ramjet combined cycle platform doesn't need to carry an oxidizer on board like a rocket motor does. And that frees up all that weight for more fuel to keep it flying for further. Ward Carroll is another great channel. Ward's a good friend of mine. In fact, Ward was one of the guys who interviewed me for this job. He doesn't work for Sandboxx, but he knows the founders of Sandboxx real well. And when they wanted to know that they were hiring someone who knew what they were talking about, they asked Ward to do an interview with me, and I credit him with me getting this job. I know somebody dropped a few bucks in here. Here we go, Eddie. What's new with railguns for $4.99? Well, Japan just put their first ship-based railgun into testing, but the U.S. Navy has largely moved away from railguns. In fact, about a year and a half ago, they ended funding for their railgun programs and put it all toward lasers instead, because the Navy believes that lasers are a more practical application for the funding. That's not to say that railgun technology isn't going to end up having, a real use case in warfare, but it's the sort of thing, just like we were saying before with air defenses, it comes down to resources and political will. And it takes a fair amount of resources and political will to fund efforts like railguns, because you need to explain to lawmakers why it might be better than the technology that we currently have. And that includes a fair bit of both cultural and economic inertia. Task and Purpose's YouTube channel, Jason mentioned in there. I did watch one of Task and Purpose's videos not too long ago. Sandboxx News actually has a syndication agreement with a number of outlets, including Task and Purpose. So it's not unusual to see one of my articles end up on their website. So I figured I'd click on one of the videos. I think it was about the F-15EX, and I was really pleasantly surprised. They do some great content over there. Not that I expected it to be bad, but I was impressed with how good it was. Alex, is a flying wing design capable of stable supersonic flight? B-2 and B-21 are subsonic. You're right. And the answer there is, yeah, almost certainly, especially with modern flight control systems. But the trade-off isn't necessarily there. The reason why these strategic bombers like the B-2 and B-21 are subsonic rather than supersonic is because the amount of fuel it takes, the amount of fuel you need to expend to get up to supersonic speeds and maintain it, just dramatically reduce the range of an aircraft. A good example of that might be, the F-35. The C has got the most fuel on board. It's got the most internal storage. And according to the Navy, it's got a combat radius of some 690 miles. As some people have talked to me about on Twitter, it's probably a bit better than that. But for a strategic bomber, that would not cut it. You need 1,500, 2,000, even more miles unrefueled range for a strategic bomber. So subsonic is just sort of the way to go. Likewise with cruise missiles. It's the reason why cruise missiles tend to be subsonic. The AGM-86 might be slow, but it'll do 1,500 miles. Perun has a great humor and insights. Millennium 7 goes really deep into tech. Also, he's Italian like me, and that's a plus. I haven't watched much or any of either of their content, but I've heard over and over that their channels are great. So I would definitely recommend checking them out. Just like in my old fighting days, when I would go from gym to gym to see if I want to try to learn Muay Thai or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu next, find the places, the outlets that are not just trustworthy, not just reliable, but relay information in a way that speaks to you. And that's the best way to retain it. So, I highly recommend exploring all different kinds of channels, but of course, watch this one because it's the reason why I have electricity and it's how I feed my kid. Let's see. Cheaper, smaller, high volume drones. Do you think this is the future? Yep, that is 100% the future. And the reason for that is that it is really difficult to replace today's multi-role platforms. I mentioned this in a video recently, but it takes, 60,000 hours or something crazy like that to build an F-35C. It takes 5 times as long to build a carrier fighter today than it did during World War II. So every loss would be felt that much deeper. And as a result, it just makes sense to lean into platforms like the Kratos Valkyrie, the XQ-58. I am a huge fan of the Valkyrie just because it's an extremely low cost and low observable, high subsonic platform. It can carry a pair of small diameter bombs right now. It's not necessarily, a game changing in terms of payload, but it costs, if you buy it at volume, about the same as a Tomahawk cruise missile for a reusable, low observable UCAV. That is a game-changing situation if we can get them into high-volume production. With talked about manned UAV pairing, I can't help but think of the dreadnought effect. When a technological development renders your lead obsolete, might that happen with the 6th generation? Possible, but I think unlikely with the 6th generation. The reason why I say that is because it's really important, again, to remember that balance of capability and capacity. The reason why the US doesn't already have an all-stealth fighter fleet is that problem of balancing capability against capacity. In that, I mean, you only have so much money and you have so many obligational requirements. So you need to come up with the mix of aircraft that gives you, the most capable deterrent effect, but also the most capable tactical effect while meeting those obligations. The Air Force could not afford to have a fleet of all F-35s and F-22s and still do the jobs that it does every day. That's why F-15s and F-16s are still so important. And as 6th-gen fighters emerge, we're going to see that happening still. 5th-gen fighters will get cheaper to operate as they become more commonplace. If we can get ceramic-based radar-absorbent materials instead of the polymer-based RAM we use today, this is all going to cut the cost of 5th-gen jets dramatically. And eventually, we may come to the point where those sorts of stealth fighters are the common aircraft like today's 4th-gen jets are. Those 6th-gen aircraft that'll be prioritizing, I assume, things like low-frequency radar stealth, as well as a much higher degree of sensor fusion and AI-enabled wingmen. That will be the new sort of really expensive kid on the block that you can't afford to buy enough of to sort of replace your fleet. And, we're seeing that manifest in countries outside of the US in an even more stark fashion. Russia's got 7 production Su-57s. China has maybe 200 to 250 J-20s, but none of them have the WS-15 engine on board that the aircraft was actually designed to operate. And we don't know how many of those 200 or 250 are even operational. It could be none. It could be all of them. We don't know because they don't disclose it. So for 6th-gen fighters to emerge in the next 10 years and then sort of like run the gamut would be pretty unlikely just because of cost. Dear Alex, any role for drones and clearing Gaza tunnels? I thought something like RC cars would be useful for going around corners with cameras and grenades. Tunnel warfare is, in my opinion, the most terrifying thing you could do short of being maybe in a SEAL delivery vehicle, SDVs, like the small SEAL submarines. I think that would be the scariest for me because I'm not really comfortable with the water. But short of drowning, putting me in a tunnel is pretty high on my list of worst fears. I've done a number of stories along with former Green Berets like Jack Murphy and Delta Force operators like George Hand on how U.S. special operators are trying to use advanced technology for tunnel warfare. And that includes things like quadcopter drones, not necessarily RC ones like that would be on wheels, but quadcopter ones and similar that would fly through and map the tunnel area, as well as identifying things like booby traps and stuff ahead of you. And that could really cut down the risks associated with tunnel warfare, but we are still talking about a very terrifying enterprise. And Gaza is one of the few places on Earth with extremely elaborate and utterly unmapped by outside parties tunnel systems. That is not a form of combat that I would like to participate in. They need the nuclear, have conventional engines go up to their altitude biggest day for years with a nuclear engine. Nuclear engines have been tried in the past, not just with Project Pluto and the SLAM missile or Russia's current Skyfall or Burevestnik missile, but also the NB-36 Crusader was a B-36 Peacemaker bomber that actually flew with a functioning nuclear reactor on board. They did design a nuclear propulsion system for it, which is a complicated mess of things, but it effectively amounted to being a heat pump of sorts. But it never actually flew under nuclear propulsion. It flew under turbojet propulsion with that nuclear reactor just sort of running. And in between flights, they would actually lower the reactor through the bomb bay doors into an underground shelter. It's a pretty scary prospect. But down the road, especially fusion, if that ever manifests, nuclear-powered aircraft are just about a sure thing. But to be honest with you, if we can master containerized fusion, the reasons for conflict in this world would dramatically reduce pretty quickly. So maybe we wouldn't need so many nuclear-powered tactical aircraft. Do you think the U.S. can handle 2 proxy wars at the same time while simultaneously defending the continental U.S. and keeping an eye on Taiwan? That is a big question. Now, the answer I would say is yes, but context matters in this and all circumstances, right? So the level of support the United States needs to provide to both Ukraine and Israel is a big question mark here. Not to mention, the level of threat being posed by other, I would call them bad actors, but certainly from their perspective, they might even call the United States bad actors, like China. I see China as the most looming geopolitical threat on the horizon. But there isn't really an incentive for China to want to launch a military campaign against Taiwan or the United States, for that matter, in short order. Even without U.S. intervention, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be extremely costly. And then they would be facing a pretty prolonged and brutal insurgency, which, as an American veteran, I can speak to is not something any nation really wants to deal with. And there's no real indicator that China sort of has a good answer for what that insurgency would look like. So I think that China tends to use Taiwan as a really good excuse for military modernization and saber rattling, rather than sort of showing their hands with things like wanting to take over greater economic control of the majority of the South China Sea. China's military modernization efforts have a lot more to do with gaining economic control over that waterway, in my opinion, than their plans in the short term to invade Taiwan. I think Taiwan is just sort of the, hey, look at there, that they can use to justify all the money that they're dumping into defense without raising a lot of questions. Sort of like when Frontier Airlines said that, we're going to charge you to check your bags. That's why these flights are so much cheaper. It's not because, our pilots are paid less. China is likewise saying we're modernizing because we want Taiwan. No reason to look at, these oil rigs in Vietnam that we are surrounding with fishing vessels. I believe we already have spaceships, the TR-3 Black Manta, but we have big ones. I have pictures. I've got a two-part series on the TR-3A/B. I don't believe that the TR-3B with an anti-gravity drive, as a lot of people tend to think, is in operation. However, I do believe that there have been lots of big black triangles that have as yet been undisclosed to the public that have been tested, maybe even operated in combat. And that's sort of where the TR-3 mythos comes from. The earliest reports were of a TR-3A that was reportedly operating alongside the F-117 in Desert Storm. I don't think that was actually happening, but it was a really prominent rumor reported by Aviation Week and Popular Mechanics at the time. I think that the TR-3 sort of legend all kind of consumes all of the weird black triangles that really have been flying over the US for many years that we maybe don't have a name for. Do you legitimately think China could win a war against NATO and win? I don't think so, but that's not really the question we should be asking. Winning a war is not a great outcome. Winning a war is the preferred outcome over losing a war, but ultimately, winning a war means that we failed to deter the war from starting in the first place. And the only real, win state, the only real victory when it comes to military technology and geopolitical posturing is deterring conflict, because winning a war could potentially mean losing a great deal of resources and personnel, crippling your economy, crippling the global economy, putting the United States back decades in terms of technological development. But we won. That's a worse day than deterring a conflict from starting in the first place and Chinese and American citizens getting to maintain a high standard of living. What do you think the U.S. should take away from the war in Ukraine when it comes to helicopters? How do you see this affecting the V-280 program? I'm going to answer one more question after this, and then I really got to call it. But that's a great question, because in Ukraine, we've seen helicopters not operating very much or effectively right up on the front lines as attack platforms, which historically is part of how the United States tends to leverage them. But I would say helicopters aren't going anywhere. And platforms like the V-280, while technically a tilt-rotor aircraft rather than a helicopter, by definition, are the reason why we'll see rotorcraft stick around for a long time. First of all, it is really tough to beat the utility of a rotorcraft, whether helicopter or tilt rotor. But the V280 sort of blends the best assets of a helicopter and an airplane design. It's got 2 to 3 times the range of an H-60 series helicopter, quite a bit more speed. They're pretty spacious inside, and they're honestly pretty agile. You do still need to worry about not just surface-to-air missile threats, but things like man-pads and stuff like that. But this is where mission planning, which is the part of, sort of the combat enterprise that people discuss less and less, but is actually the most important part, comes into play, because mission planning is how you make helicopters survivable. For instance, we've seen Apache gunships like the AH-64 leading the way in offensive attack operations in the earliest days of combat operations, in Desert Storm and forward. It's all about good intel, good timely intelligence about the air defense threats in a specific region, as well as potential targets, and then using the right tools in the right places. If there isn't a huge air defense threat in a certain area, you can use Apaches to engage that, while you use the B-21 to take out air defense assets in a close by region to sort of lead the way, and so on and so forth. In other words, helicopters aren't going anywhere, but the way in which we employ them does need to change with the times. Sandboxx is the most awesomest, from a USAF veteran and 12-year Iraq and Afghanistan contractor. Love the intelligent videos. Thank you. That genuinely means the world to me. So this will be my last question here. Is there convergent evolution concerning the B-21 and NGAD? Both seem to have similar design emphasis and could have mission overlap. The answer there is sure could be. I'll tell you, in my opinion, yes. We don't know, obviously, which design is ultimately going to win the NGAD contract, nor do we know much about the Boeing or Lockheed Martin designs that are currently competing. But what we do know is that even the Congressional Research Service has said in no uncertain terms that the NGAD fighter may have more in common with the B-21 than it does with the F-22. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. The F-22 Raptor is an extremely dynamic dogfighter, close quarters fighter, thanks to things like thrust vector control and just its massive wing area, for instance, not to mention all the power that it can pump out of those F-119s. But the F-22 was designed as sort of a technology bridge between the old school hot rod fighters of the 1980s and the new school sort of very sneaky snipers like the F-35 we have today. The F-22 sort of tried to land somewhere squarely in the middle of those two, bringing sort of the power and maneuverability you'd expect from an F-15, or even better, with the stealth and sensor fusion capabilities you'd expect out of a 5th generation fighter, right? So what we see as a result is an aircraft that's really good at long range and really pretty good at close range fighting too, but it moved toward specifically long range fighting with the F-35. The F-35's got a decent power to weight ratio, and it's surprisingly maneuverable. People think that it's, not able to dogfight F-16s. That's based on some bunk reporting from an early test article F-35. It's a pretty capable dogfighter, but if you're dogfighting in an F-35, you're already having a very bad day. The F-22, much more at home in that environment. The NGAD looks like it is very likely going further into that F-35's line of thought, where it's going to use longer ranged sensors, longer ranged weapons to engage targets, and rely more on stealth than on the ability to outmaneuver enemies or munitions. But you can compensate for some of that lack of maneuverability with things like, the AIM-9X, which is a thrust vectoring air-to-air missile that can do incredible maneuvers. You can launch an AIM-9X at a target behind you, and it'll do a 180 in the air and go back after that target. So rather than the aircraft being more maneuverable, we're going to see increasingly maneuverable munitions that are leveraged by those aircraft at longer ranges than ever. I'm sorry I didn't get to answer everybody's questions. Hopefully I did give you a pretty good answer for the ones that I got to. I want to make sure to remind you guys that tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m., we will be launching our first episode of ManPower, starring Luke Ryan, talking about how you even become a U.S. Army Ranger, and then what life is like deploying to combat with a Ranger tab on your shoulder. So I really appreciate your guys' support. Please make sure to jump in and support Luke too, because he's just genuinely a good guy. And you'll see me again probably later this week. Thank you so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it.